Good morning, East Bay. What is happening in Alameda, Contra Costa, and Solano counties? Learn about what's happening in our communities, an in-depth conversation so you know what's going on. We're talking to government, economic, political, nonprofit, and business leaders. I'm Jared Asch, the host of the Capstone Conversation. Welcome to today's episode of the Capstone Conversation. I'm your host, Jared Asch, and I am joined today by former Assembly member Ted Lempert. Ted is also a professor at UC Berkeley in political science, and it is that side of him more than the others that we are going to hear his expertise on today. We're going to do an analysis of the races in the East Bay. What's happening as a result of March 5th? How did the final counts go? And just some analysis and have a conversation of what really went on so we could understand that. So thanks for joining us today, Ted.
My pleasure. Look forward to it. Thanks, Jared.
Anything about your background that you want to add in there to give some insight for listeners?
Sure. Well, I've been teaching California politics at Cal for a number of years, so happy to share some insights wearing that hat. And actually, it's Children Now that I run. We're a statewide advocacy organization, whole child group that does work throughout the state and advocates for kids in Sacramento. And then certainly my former life as an elected official in the state assembly, and then on the board of supervisors in San Mateo County.
Awesome. Let's dive into some of these election results. So up in Senate District 3, where Senator Dodd is term limited and stepping down, we've got the race covers Solano, parts of Sonoma, parts of Yolo County. And one of the things that I found interesting here is that the winner of that race did not receive the big endorsements, right? You had a candidate who came in third in the race, Councilwoman Verda Aliga from Vallejo. And she received the endorsements of Garamendi and Dodd and the Democratic Party and others, yet she came in third, so not even making the runoff. Can you add some insights to that?
Sure. Yeah, I'll get into that race specifically, but I think there's a general theme with this March primary that I think relates to the races in the East Bay, Contra Costa County, further north and throughout the state. And that is, as you know, first, it was a very small turnout, and that low turnout, I think, created some surprises. And then with top two, you had that dynamic going on. And I think in this race where Christopher Cabaldon came out on top among the Democrats, the Republican came out on top, but, Christopher obviously is now the almost certain winner, given it's a Democratic district. I think when you have multiple Democrats, or in a Republican district, multiple Republicans, you might see some surprises. And then the other piece, and then I'll get to this district, Senate District 3, is clearly having the support of the Democratic Party, labor, party establishment helps a ton. Although in a number of these races that support was split a little bit among labor and split among the Democratic base, other groups like environmentalists, pro-choice, others, and that can lead to what some folks might have viewed as a surprise. So I say some folks, I wasn't totally surprised about what happened in Senate District 3, even though Verda Aliga had the support of the outgoing state senator Dodd and the party, because Cabaldon, actually had support from some Democratic constituencies, Sierra Club, Equity California, Planned Parenthood. And then, as we've seen in a lot of these legislative races, money, unfortunately, plays a big deal. And you had significant, just to make it simple, I'd say business dollars. That's sort of an overgeneralization, but some business dollars going to Cabaldon, and then sort of a lot of the labor dollars being split between Elward and Verda Aliga. So, I think if Cabaldon was head to head against just one of them, it might have been different. But, he certainly had financial resources, and he had some of the Democratic base, even though he didn't have sort of the establishment base and the party base, he had key constituencies. And then the last piece of this is, this is true in my day in politics and just as true today. Running for office, as you know, is really hard work and takes a lot of time. And sometimes it doesn't always work this way, but sometimes the person that literally works the hardest and is out there nonstop for a long time, makes a difference. And I know, not a knock on the other two Democrats, but I know Cabaldon was really scrappy, worked as hard for quite a long time and had run for assembly in past cycles. So, he had that going for him.
Yeah, I think that's right. In that race, he showed up everywhere,
Yeah.
and he was responsive. He was responding to emails. I heard and had seen directly to people where other people had it staffed out or whatnot, and because they had other jobs and made it difficult for them to do it.
Yeah.
And I think he was fortunate. He had a lot of flexibility with his job that he was able to be everywhere.
It's actually, I tell my students, uh, one big reason for incumbent advantage, obviously, is money and name recognition. But another is what you just said, right? If you're in the legislature, the way that job is set up, you have some flexibility in being able to campaign a lot, where if you're a council member with another job, then campaigning on top of that for a big office is really tough.
Right. It's the time commitment and family priorities and everything else in the
Yeah.
middle of it all. So we're going to come back to the East Bay races. I want to jump to the U.S. Senate race because you did give an overall perspective of the statewide turnout
Yep.
and talked about a small turnout. This is the first competitive Senate race, right? We've seen in 30 plus years in California. Steve Garvey is ahead in the special. He's ahead for the 6-week seat that would take place. And where Schiff is slightly ahead of him for first place there. But Porter and Lee didn't even amount. Schiff had more than double their totals. So let's talk about the Senate race and what you saw there and what were some of the trends.
Yeah, sure. Well, several things. I mean, this was like a top two special, right? I think the question sort of brings back memories of the gubernatorial race several years ago when Newsom won the first time, yeah, when he had a race, and that is, the leading Democrat in a statewide race so much wants a Republican to do well, right? Because then this, if folks remember, that was when Villaraigosa was running a strong campaign for governor back in how time flies, 2018, right? Yeah, 2018. And, Gavin's whole focus was hopefully a Republican would come in first or second. So then the race would be over, early. And so that was similarly, Schiff's hope here. And, there was a lot of focus on how he highlighted, Garvey as a threat. And then plus just with the low turnout election, the Republican vote statewide is going to be magnified a little bit, right? So, Republicans did a little bit better. Conservatives did a little bit better because with the small turnout, the Republicans were helped by that. So all that led to, regardless of Garvey seemingly doing so well, clearly, I don't like using the word impossible, but man, anyone who would bet on a Republican winning a U.S. Senate race in California that needs to think that through. So, I think Adams, clearly headed to the Senate. It was, actually a couple, very different dynamics than the state Senate race we were just talking about. But the fact that Porter and Lee and Schiff were all in there were three of them rather than a head to head, I think, helped Adams some as well. And that my guess is, Lee took some votes away from Porter, vice versa, so that helped Adams. And then it's funny to say this on a statewide race, where obviously retail campaigning, person to person is tough. Although, folks will remember, Bill Clinton famously spending hours at the Roboline, every voter voting for president. But, they all worked hard, but I know, especially Barbara Lee and Adam Schiff very well. I don't know Porter as well, but people call me a hard worker. I don't think I've ever met someone who works with an Adam Schiff. And so, in addition to all the things we just talked about, he was just a very disciplined candidate who, was in the race early and, just was at it nonstop. And, and I thought ran a really strategic campaign.
How did money play a role in that race? Because Schiff had I think just like he had the votes, he had a lot more money than Porter, but Lee barely raised any money, right? So what was the impact of where? Well, Garvey didn't raise any money, but was repelled, like you said, by that conservative base. So how much did the capital raising impact that race? If Porter had raised more, would it have changed the results? Or
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of focus on this, how un unfortunately money matters way too much. And, as someone who's worked for years for campaign finance reform, it's just disgusting how much money matters. In some cases, it doesn't matter quite as much as folks think. I mean, like obviously Garvey just being the main Republican on the ballot benefited. Sometimes in these really high profile races, US Senate races across the country, or even in this one now coming up in November, the amounts get so high that the number two in money has plenty. But in this case, I think the money made a difference. I mean, part of my comment about Adam being a incredibly hardworking both member of Congress and candidate, was he was an amazing fundraiser. Obviously, Pelosi's support helped, and Adam was able to raise a lot. Porter raised some. Now, the other thing is there was attack money on Porter, right? So there, she raised money, but there was also more money against her, independent expenditure against her. And then, I think Barbara Lee was very justified in her frustration with her inability to raise more dollars, because that really hurt her a lot, especially in a statewide race where, a lot of this is just name recognition and being on television a lot.
yeah, so I appreciate those insights into the Senate race, and we'll stick with one more statewide before we head local. Prop 1. We're recording this on April 1st. It'll probably play on April 10th. So we're about 12 days, I think, left in the certification process here in California when we're recording it. It looks like Prop 1 is 28,000 votes ahead, and this is the governor's mental health initiative. Do you see it holding ahead and passing? And what are your thoughts? Why was this one so close?
Yeah, no, well, so I'll weigh in both with my teaching California politics at Cal had, but also Children Now was very involved in this measure and pushed for some important changes in it, and especially in terms of protecting funding for youth mental health. So I think the general reaction among, the media and political folks was like, oh my gosh, this almost lost, even though it looks for sure that it's, won, it's close margin, but it's won and the opponents has conceded. I think a couple things going on that didn't get enough focus was one, low turnout. I mean, I know that governor cared so much about this and, wanted it singularly on the ballot. Far be it from me to question his political team. They're amazing, but it was risky having it on this low turnout ballot, right? And maybe at the time they didn't realize how low turnout it would be. And so, you're elevating the conservative vote. And, I think that when it was billed as Newsom's initiative, I think a lot of Republican voters, fairly or not, just were voting on like, oh, this is a Democratic thing rather than looking at what it did, right? So that built opposition. And then the other piece is there was some opposition on the left to this, and in a low turnout election, the voters tend to be more wired in, right? That they tend to be slightly more, I don't want to say highly educated, they're just more politically attuned voters. So even though the opposition on the left, by some mental health groups, not on the kids side, we were able to address the concerns there, but more, adult mental health, some of the homelessness groups who opposed it, usually that wouldn't make as much difference, but since it was small turnout, some of that lack of support on the left, made it close. So it was the combination of small turnout, Republicans almost reflexively voting no, because it was sort of like, oh, this is Newsom, we're going to vote no. I think if it was just on the issue, probably would have gotten some more Republican support. And then, because there was some opposition on the left. And then the final thing is I don't need to tell your listening audience, homelessness is complicated. It's a lot of folks who listen to this are struggling with it, in their regions and their cities. And it was a complicated initiative, and complexity doesn't do well, in a statewide initiative vote. I know they try to make the pitch really simple, but if folks even glanced at the ballot description and started looking into it, it was more complex than usual. So, that made it more difficult. I mean, in general, as I tell my students, initiatives fail more often than they pass. They're more likely to fail than pass. So any initiative has a little bit of a hurdle, regardless of what it is, right? Because the odds are more that it fails than that it passes.
I was in Sacramento 2 weeks ago for a Bay Area Council event, and somebody was doing an analysis on them, and he said, I can always help you lose an initiative because more people will vote for failure.
Yep.
But if you really want to win, you have to build, one, a strong coalition, and two, spend $30 million.
Yep.
And this didn't have that funding to it at all. I think it was $5 to $8 million, somewhere around there were the total. So very little advertising, really just the governor putting some muscle behind it.
Yeah. No, and I think it goes out saying this would not have passed if he had not put his reputation behind it. That's for sure. I mean, as it was it was close.
And so do you think it would have had a different outcome in November because you'd have a higher turnout in the presidential?
Yeah, I do. And this gets back to knowing some of them and having great respect for them. I mean, I've been involved in politics. I teach California politics, but the governor's political just looking at polls and knowing what's going on all the time. I think their reasoning was, well, it's complicated and there's be a bunch of measures on the ballot in November and folks might get confused and might not come down and vote for it. And we just don't want to get caught up in all that. I get that reasoning. That being said, I think it would have done much better in a high turnout election because folks would have said, Democratic Party supports this, governor supports this. It looks like this is something that Democrats are all supporting, so I'll vote for it. So, it might have been a mistake, although it's going to pass, even though by a little bit. So fine, but
all you need is +1, right?
Yeah, +1. But it was a little odd because even though the November ballot would be more complicated, it would be such a higher turnout that I think it would have probably done a little better.
I wonder if they thought the turnout would have been higher driven by the Senate race on the Democratic side. And maybe that was miscalculated.
This goes back. I can give you so many examples because I've been involved in this for a while now, over the last few decades where other folks made that mistake where they went for a, March or June, a primary initiative with the turnout's going to be higher because there's going to be this gubernatorial primary, there's going to be this presidential fight and folks are going to turn out for that. And it seems like almost every time folks made that calculation, they were wrong. The turnout was low and, in some cases, measures have lost. And I think back to a measure Children Now was involved with. Wow, this is way back in 2006, long time ago. But the thinking was, this measure makes sense on the primary ballot because there's a primary for governor, against, to see who would run against Schwarzenegger. And of course, gubernatorial primaries don't have that big a turnout.
Yeah. So let's come back local and talk about Senate District 7, which is the seat that Nancy Skinner is term limited from. You've got the mayor of Berkeley and an Oakland councilman headed to the runoff, in what was a very Democratic race. So you have two Democrats moving forward.
Yep.
Any insights into this race? I think it's 80% in Alameda County, maybe a little bit in parts of Contra Costa, like Hercules and parts of Richmond. Tell us a little bit more about what your thoughts are on this race and the candidates going forward.
Yeah, I just think big picture, a little bit similar to what we've been talking about, and even the Cabaldan race in Senate District 3, and that the Democratic and heavily Democratic seat, I should say. So the Democratic constituencies were more split than folks were imagining. So I think a lot of folks are surprised, and excuse me if I get the names wrong, that Liebarger didn't do better, because she had such strong labor support, especially from SEIU, CTA, but it's not like she had complete Democratic support, so there were some other Democratic based groups, including labor, like the school employees supported Swanson. And then, Jesse Aragon, the Berkeley mayor council member who came in first, he had some labor support. He had the building trades, he had firefighters, and then he also had that business support similar to what Cabalden had. So, I think a theme here is like folks say, oh, the person with the most Democratic based constituency support is going to win. Well, in a Democratic seat. Well, yeah, if they had all of the Democratic constituency, like if they had all of labor and all of all the environmental groups, that's one thing. But it was really split up among this race. I mean, Kalb, who's on the Oakland City Council, he didn't make the top two, but he had environmental support. So there was you had a lot of candidates in that race. The support among interest groups was split a fair amount, and so even though Jesse wasn't the Democratic, party supported candidate, he still did really well. And the other thing there too is we're talking about groups that support and put money behind people. Another unfortunate part about campaigns and politics is going after people really works too. And so part of why Limburger did do as well, I think, is that there was a really concentrated campaign against her, right? And that, clearly had some impact. And I don't know the candidates. I didn't know the candidates quite as well in this race as some of the others, but I wouldn't be surprised if just how you ran the campaign, right? Played a role, and just, not just the strategy and how you work, but just, how hard you worked it, and, making sure that you had your base from the area you were from covered, and then, building out from there.
There's been a lot of talk in the past couple of election cycles about particularly labor's involvement here in the Bay Area, where they've been pushing for more equity driven, more labor backed candidates. Here, it sounds like a couple of, if labor is not 100% unified behind somebody, it makes a difference. Or do you think it was sort of, give me some insight into that, right? Labor's role versus the business groups. Did business have a couple of victories?
Yeah, business certainly did. And to your point, it's funny, not to get off on a tangent, but part of my full-time job, in addition to teaching this course, right? So now I always talk about how kids' issues need more concentrated advocacy, right? You got all these people advocating for kids. It needs to be more connected. I generally use labor and business as the example of how to do it, meaning there's lots of labor groups, but they tend to stick together. There's lots of business groups, but they tend to stick together. Especially true on like the day-to-day policy making, supporting bills and that kind of thing. But when they split, they're a lot weaker, right? And so labor is incredibly powerful in California and incredibly powerful in these campaigns. But in these, some of these examples we talked about already, labor was split. Yes, SEIU, CTA are sort of the most powerful labor groups in California, but building trades, firefighters, other labor groups are powerful too. So absolutely, I think when folks say, oh, so-and-so has labor support, the next question should be, do they have all of labor, or is labor divided? Because that makes a big difference. And then business, in California, not as powerful as labor, but still really powerful. And I think in some of these races, the quote business community was a little more consolidated than labor was, if that makes sense. And so, if there's, it's hard to generalize about the business community per se, but sort of the business folks that play in California politics and put in big money, they seem much more united, behind some candidates they wanted to get elected, and that, helped make a difference.
Well, and I think we
or the fact
saw
that keeping the base together, right? It's true of just about any campaign or any advocacy thing. You got to start by trying to keep the base united. If the base is split, you're going to be in a little more trouble.
Well, and you saw that in sort of Senate District 9, where you had Tim Grayson running for the seat that Glazer's term limited from. So we're talking three term limited seats. We're going to have three new fresh senators here covering most of the East Bay. Grayson had that business support, and the Cal Chamber said it was their number one priority and wanted to unify people behind him in that race. Overwhelmingly raised more than his opponent. The race wasn't even close. I think it was 20 plus point spread. And I just think it was there. It shows like one candidate did get a lot of that business support. It was unified behind him. And I don't think labor really played in the race even as much, and maybe did a little bit on each side of the race to make friends.
Yeah, and you had this situation then, which is rare now with our term limit world, where an assembly member is moving to the Senate. Usually, people just stay put, so that made a difference too. But yeah, I mean, I think in California, especially, eh, although if I was running the business community, I'd do this more on the national level too. But in California, I think the business community says, wow, the Republicans, at least for now, at least for the foreseeable future, aren't major players, right? I mean, only the Democratic Party, which I'm a member of, could mess this up. But it's like, for the foreseeable future, maybe forever, the Democrats are so in control. The business community is saying, okay, we're going to really engage with Democrats, right? We're going to, work with Democrats and find folks who we think we can work with the best. And, they've had, a pretty big impact in doing that. My comment about nationally is you would think, maybe hope that the national business world would, wow, these Republicans are, sort of off the grid here a little bit. Let's support more Democrats. But in California, the business community plays, a significant role because they really engage in these Democratic races.
I remember just learning some of the lessons about Bill Clinton's election and the Democrats running at local levels. The ones who were winning were pro-business Democrats going back to the mid 90s, right? They call themselves the New Deal Democrats. And they supported business and entrepreneurs and internet and technology. And that helped, steer Clinton into and moderates at that time.
Yeah,
so it makes sense.
It's
Democrats have moved away from that.
Yeah, and what's fascinating is like, on the one hand, the progressive movement is so much stronger. And, I talk to my students a lot about this, who sort of far more progressive than, quote, moderate. And I think in some cases, you see the power of that increased progressivism. And you see it in some races, like a little further east to Mayor of Sacramento's race, right? The top polling candidate, Dr. Flo, was, a really strong progressive, not, didn't get any business support, was not established support. So you see progressives doing well in some races. That said, especially when things are split and the progressive community is split, like with Lee and Porter, and the business community is really focused and there's that money, moderates can still do well. So it's sort of it seems contradictory, because the Democratic Party and the voters are certainly more progressive today than they were back in Clinton's day. But in terms of funding campaigns and campaign dynamics, especially if you have multiple candidates splitting the more progressive vote, a moderate can do very well, and the business community can play a big role.
That's interesting. And you sort of see that dynamic in Assembly District 15, which is all in Contra Costa County, where you have Grayson, who you talked about earlier, moved up from the Assembly to the Senate, or is looking to. And here you have a race where Monica Wilson, who was a councilwoman from Antioch, got very early support, and pretty much, I think, all very unified support from labor, who dumped in more than $1 million into the race. You have Karen Mitchoff, who was a county supervisor for 12, 16 years, recently retired. So she was out of office for 2 years, but had the name recognition, had unions knew her. So they weren't necessarily opposed to her. She was a union employee, I think a member of SCIU for a long time herself. But they all went for Wilson. Well, neither one of them made the runoff.
Yep.
Talk about that race and what happened there.
Well, so first of all, you can always get surprises. This, I think, was a surprise, as you're suggesting. And, at first I'd go back to a couple themes we've talked about. Low turnout, right? So if this is a much higher turnout election, I think Wilson would have done better. And, that she was close. I think Wilson had, much more unified support. It wasn't, complete. I think Avila Ferris had, some law enforcement unions and stuff, which helped her. And, I was looking at this race because it was a surprise. And, it's possible that, Avila Ferris got a lot of free media, about, like that whole 4th of July boycott thing, got a lot that, she had been involved with. And there was a lot of issues. And then I think, her being a Latina played a role. The one other thing with this race, and I know Mitchoff had been in office a long time, but, and was well respected in the county. But once you're out of office, and I know this from personal experience, once you're out of office and try to run to go back, it's difficult, because you lose, as a council member, as a county supervisor, certainly as a legislator, when you're running, it gives you a real advantage because you're in office, you have the connections. People might not want to piss you off. Where when you're out, it's just a lot more difficult. So I think, you look at Mitchoff's vote and go, wow, 12, what I think was around 12%. I know that it's not finalized. Folks are like, wow, that's surprising, because she had been in office so long and should have been more popular. Yes, but, she was out of office during this campaign, and I'm guessing that hurt some, in terms of it. People, name recognition stays somewhat, but it's in terms of people lining up and supporting folks, it helps if you're in office. And this gets back to just the advantage of incumbency and plus why people work so, I shouldn't say this, why people work so hard to stay in office, because if you're not in, it's harder to get back in.
Hey, well, I saw that in Indiana. I used to work back in the day for Senator Evan Bayh, and he was a Secretary of State, a 2-term governor, and a new Democrat in a red state, served 3 terms in the U.S. Senate, stepped aside. And I think it was 2, maybe 4 years later, he decided to come back and run for an open Senate seat and got clobbered. But they used against him. He had always lived in DC because he had young kids when he was elected to the Senate, elected to governor in his, I think at 30. So
Wow.
we're only talking like 50, 55
Yeah.
when he was running, and his kids were young. They went to school in DC. But he had sort of left his roots from Indiana. And I think people were willing to forgive that when you were the senator for so long and continue to vote across party line. But then they didn't, right?
Yep. No, absolutely. I mean, there's examples of where folks have come back, not in office, but I do think it makes a difference. And obviously I was surprised by these results and, by several things, but including Mitchoff not doing better. But the other thing you said, actually, when you asked the question originally, it goes back to splitting the base. I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but when the base is split, and so your comment about how Mitchoff was well liked by labor as well, and well liked by a lot of Democrats. So if it had been a one-on-one race, among key Democrats, I'm sure Wilson would have done better. But I think Mitchoff drained some votes in that sense.
So how did Anne Marie Avilia Ferris, how did she sneak in? She had a tenth of the money as
Yeah.
the others. She was a former vice mayor of Martinez, but I don't think she was currently serving. How did she gain the momentum? I know you mentioned the free press, but what are some other things she did right, or the demographics that worked in her favor?
Yeah, I think the demographics helped. And again, I mean, there's, I, I always smile when I say political science, the science part, 'cause it's hard to predict. I mean, this was a surprise, so it's hard to piece together exactly. But yeah, the demographics I think made a difference. Maybe even though other candidates had more money there, maybe their name recognition wasn't quite as high as folks thought, which was an issue. And it was close, right? And, again, the small turnout, I think there were just some surprises across the state. And, the smaller turnout, contributed to that. Although, I'm going to contradict myself here because you could have sort of argued the smaller turnout would have helped, a Mitchoff or, Wilson, because they were, known and had a lot more established support. So it was a bit of a surprise, but, I think the demographic, I think, being the only Latino in the race, the free press, and then what I don't know, I know some of these candidates, but I wasn't following the race closely. Don't discount campaign strategy, how hard the candidate worked, how they piece things together. I mean, I don't know the details there, but I'm uh, and this might not be accurate in this race, but some candidates work harder than others, and it can make a big difference.
Sometimes that's the stealthy candidate can sneak through, and while the others battle it out. So this one, the Democrat came in second to a Republican. Is this sort of the same thing as Senate District 3? We anticipate a Democrat to overwhelmingly win come November.
Yeah, I mean, with the Independent Redistricting Commission, the politicians don't draw the seats anymore. The Independent Commission does a pretty good job, but California is so overwhelmingly Democrat that even though you can argue it's better for the process to have a lot of competitive seats, a lot of these seats are competitive, right? And especially if it's a Dem on Reap, you already know what the results got to be. Now you could, I tell my students, it's impossible to have a whole lot of competitive seats because the seats need to be compact, right? You can't draw squiggles throughout the state. So, at best you're going to get 20% that maybe a quarter of seats are even somewhat competitive, but that's being pretty generous. So, so many of these districts are pretty set. And if it's a Dem on Reap, in a lot of these races, you almost know for sure who's going to win in November.
Yeah, and let's go back to DC, but keep it local. We have Barbara Lee's seat is open for the first time in a very long time. What happened there? And I think it was surprising for me, at least, to see what seemingly like a very clear winner in a very competitive race in primary.
Yeah. So what did happen in that district that didn't happen in any of the ones we've talked about is a really strong candidate came forward and cleared the field of other major candidates. And so it's not that it wasn't crowded, but, a lot of the big names that had been thought of to run for that congressional district decided not to. And Latifah Simon, who's very well respected, not just from her service on the BART board, but involved in philanthropy, involved in, very well known in Oakland and through her work, was able to clear the field of significant competition. So she had competition, but a lot of the folks were asking about, like, former mayor of Oakland, Nancy Skinner, a legislator, would a bigger, higher profile Democrat enter that race. And Simon was able to clear the field. So she had opposition, but none of her opponents were at the, level that could, to defeat her. And plus the folks, when I say she cleared the field of significant opponents, those significant potential opponents all endorsed her. And so, she really did unify the sort of Democratic establishment support pretty early on.
No, that's helpful. And let's talk about one other congressional race, the one in San Jose and Silicon Valley. You have former mayor of San Jose did fairly well in the primary. It's clearly a Democratic race. You're going to have two Democrats win no matter and go on to November. Last I saw, it was a 2-vote margin for Simidian over the supervisor over Evan Lowe, an assembly member, but that's gone back and forth. What even happens? Is it going to get decided by 2 votes in the end? And what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, so I'm a lecturer in political science at Berkeley. I lecture my students a lot about the poor voting rates of 18 to 24-year-olds, right? The voting rates are terrible among young people. And, one of the things you hear from young people, among many others, is, well, my vote doesn't make a difference. Well, this race shows that every vote can make a big difference. So, whoever comes in second and advances to November between Smitty and Lowe, can you imagine if you were a friend, or God forbid, a family of Smitty and Lowe's and didn't vote, and it was decided by one vote? So this is extremely close. I wouldn't be surprised if whoever comes in third asks for a recount, because it's probably going to be within a few votes. I actually learned something I didn't know as a result of this. And that is, what happens if they tie? What happens if Lowe and Smitty and tie? How does that work with top two? And the answer is, which I had not realized, is state law said that it would be top three. And so if it's actually literally tied, then the three of them have been out. The chances of that are really obviously slim, but who knows, right? It's so close. It's an interesting race. Again, a crowded race, and not just Liccardo, Lowe, and Simidian, but there was a lot of other strong candidates in that race as well. So you had a lot of folks, and lots of big bases being split. I think Mayor of San Jose, San Jose is the largest city in the Bay Area. Folks tend to sometimes forget that. Being mayor is a big deal. And so he had a lot of name recognition, and he's a very strong candidate. And then, Lowe being in the assembly, Simidian supervisor, longtime fixture, were really strong as well. So they're still counting the votes. And again, there very well could be a recount. I'm guessing that all this helps Liccardo, right? Because he came in first, and now all the focus is like who comes in second, and whoever comes in second will help. It will be very high profile that they just made it into second. But who knows? Definitely a Democratic seat, and one that gets a lot of attention, especially because it's right in the heart of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, I would imagine if I were the mayor that I would be actively raising money off of it. Hey, I'm here and my opponents aren't. Right, especially if there's a recount, that's going to take another 30 days.
Yeah.
So they could raise money, but I think everybody's going to wait to give it to them, right? They might make pledges and say, well, if you're in it, I'll give you a check, which is very different than somebody else who can have multiple fundraisers underway.
Yeah. One other point too, just if because I know you have a very politically knowledgeable audience, folks might say, oh, well, Liccardo was out of office. So I thought you had said earlier, that's really tough. Well, if you're a county supervisor or city council member, your name recognition isn't as high as you think it is, especially in a larger race. If you're mayor of San Jose, or mayor of San Francisco, or mayor of LA, or, former governor, that's at a different level. So your name recognition, stays more, and your cloud stays more. So I just want to clarify that, at that level, Mayor of San Jose is a pretty high profile position where you got a lot of press and a lot of focus. So being out for a little bit hurts less than, in general for quote, lower level race, or where your name recognition and your connections were, fade a lot more quickly once you're out of office.
Sure. And just because it was a big city and had a larger stake in the media market, it could go outside of his district, where other people are very limited to what was their old district compared to this new district, and where is their base, right? He had a much bigger base outside of his own city even.
No, that's a great point too. Like, I'm sure all your listeners, probably we know more about San Francisco politics, even though it's not that big a city, just because of the media market, right? We get bombarded with San Francisco political news. And so San Jose, a little less, but certainly far more than, another city, and, even, more than Oakland, because given how big San Jose is.
Yeah, that makes sense. In two very different parts of those congressional races. One, you talked about clearing the field of big names, and one, you had a lot of big names, and just interesting to see how the impact on those two races were.
Yep. No, absolutely.
So before we leave, thanks for your analysis on the election. Tell us a little bit more about Children Now and how people can get more information about it. What does the organization do? What's its purpose? How does it help our communities?
No, I appreciate that. I urge folks to go to our website at childrennow.org. And basically what we're trying to do is give power to kids' issues. I mean, there's a lot more support for making sure every kid gets a great education, great healthcare, all the things a kid needs than we sometimes recognized. And, what we're doing at Children Now is really bringing together that support. We lead what's called the Children's Movement of California. Believe it or not, we have over 5,400 organizations from like business groups, labor, community, parent, where what we're doing is getting folks to speak out at the same time on behalf of huge kids issues. Really important. So really giving advocacy behind kids issues a lot more strength. And we work from early childhood all the way through age 26. And just real quick, I mean, we were really instrumental in getting more funding for childcare last year, in improving Prop 1 to protect youth mental health. And then here's a stat I'll leave folks with, education has been poorly funded in California since Prop 13. So if you look at state and local taxes, we rank around 10th in the country, maybe 9th. We're a relatively high tax state, right? If you put all the taxes together, property taxes are lower, income tax is very high, sales tax. But yet we're far from being top 10 in education. Right now we're around middle of the states, probably going to drop down with this surplus. So like, one of the things that drives me is like, we need to be doing our advocacy better, because how could we be a high tax state that's, below average in education funding? That makes no sense. I don't know anyone who agrees with that. So, there's a lot to be done to improve our education system, our health systems, and our early childhood systems for kids.
Well, and I want to come back to a key point there is you're building a coalition of getting everybody, whether it's a large business or an environmental group or an equity group, and you're bringing them all together to talk about priorities for children now. And hence the name. And, that's a lot of respect, because it's not easy to wield so many people with so many different opinions. But the seems like the mantra is, hey, we all want to think about the future of California, right? And making sure we bring the next level of people up to the highest potential caliber.
Yeah. And to your point on that childcare campaign that we organized last year, we had over 1,100 groups sign on. Diverse groups, not all of, not all environmentalists or business folks or labor folks, but diverse groups. And among the groups that signed on to our letter were the State Chamber of Commerce and SEIU. How often does that happen? And it shows that like there's so much more support for kids, but it doesn't get demonstrated enough. It's almost sort of like, oh yeah, kids. And so what we're doing, and I've literally heard people in Sacramento tell me, both when I was in the legislature and since, oh yeah, kids, like, of course, kids. Well, no, not of course, like, let's really do it right. And so that's what we do at Children Now, to really put together and demonstrate the support and push really hard for the needs of kids. Because, I think we give it lip service, but there's a lot of other important issues out there, but I don't think there's anything more important than the future of our kids.
Great. Well, thank you for joining me today, Ted Lempert, a former supervisor, state legislator, head of Children's Now, and a professor at Berkeley in political science. So I appreciate all your insights on this elections, and thanks for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot, Jared. Appreciate it.
Wait, don't leave yet. Hit subscribe. Make sure you get the weekly updates. We have a new episode every